Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through, where we present analysis of foreign policy and domestic politics that cuts through the noise of corporate and ideologically driven media. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter. You can subscribe to Cutting Through at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can also become a paid subscriber or donate to support this work. It's really important right now, given everything that is going on. And you can share Cutting Through with your friends and contacts from that site as well. Today, I want to talk about Eli Sharabi. Uh, Eli Sharabi is an Israeli who was just freed from captivity in Gaza, part of the release of hostages and exchange of prisoners between Israel and the Palestinians. That was part of the ceasefire that took effect on January 19th. Sharabi yesterday testified in front of the United Nations Security Council, talking about his experiences in captivity. He talked about being beaten, being chained for days on end in very, very uncomfortable ways, with his hands behind his back, ways that clearly amounted to torture. He talked about having his ribs broken. He talked about the lack of food and medical care that he experienced. More than that, I think what was most affecting to me was that he talked about the psychological torment that he went through, that I think is inevitable when you're being held captive, certainly being held captive in a war zone, mostly underground, in tunnels and dark spaces, put together with other people. It is a horrible, horrible experience. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the taking of hostages is a war crime, period. It is not justifiable. It's not justifiable as an act of resistance. It's not in any way justified in international law. It is a crime. It is not only a war crime, but it is also just simply wrong. This never should have happened. It never should have been an issue. Hostages should be released, both by Hamas and other groups that may be holding people in Gaza still, and by Israel, who has done the exact same thing. It has held people under administrative detention, sometimes for months or years, with no charges, no trial, often no access to lawyers. And it has accelerated those practices since Israeli hostages were taken, so specifically so that they would have more people to exchange in these sorts of arrangements. All of this is criminal. It doesn't matter who does it. Doesn't matter if Israel does it. Doesn't matter if the Palestinians do it. Whoever does it, it is not okay. And it should not be acceptable to any of us under any circumstances. I also really am struck by one thing that happened to Eli Sharabi, which is after all of this and all that he went through, when he was finally released after, I think it was about 490 days in captivity, uh, he did not know that his wife and his two daughters had been killed in the October 7th attacks. Um, I cannot imagine what that must be like to go through everything he went through. And I have no doubt that the idea of seeing his wife and children again brought him through that. Um, there's not a doubt in my mind. He says it. I believe it. Why shouldn't I? And then to get that news on top of everything else, it's just unimaginable. It's horrible to even think about. Um, and I have nothing but sympathy for Eli Sharabi, as we all should, I think. Um, Sharabi has given some interviews before speaking at the UN, and I listened to his discussion, his interview on Uvda, an Israeli talk show. Read other articles about what he had been through, and frankly, most of what he said in that interview and most of what has been reported matches up very well with his UN testimony. And I say most because at the end of his testimony, and it is interesting that it is appears almost tacked on at the end of his testimony. He raised 2 points that he had not raised before. One was to ask where was the UN and the Red Cross while he was being held in captivity. Now, he of course has no way of knowing that the United Nations and the Red Cross have from day one demanded that the hostages be released and have demanded the access to which particularly the Red Cross is entitled under international law, and they were refused. This is a pernicious lie, and it is meant to reinforce the idea that the world doesn't care about Israeli victims of war crimes and of violence. It isn't true. The world does care, and I'm not just talking about the so-called pro-Israel, the far right people that Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL sidles up to and embraces, or that Benjamin Netanyahu invites to conferences on anti-Semitism. I'm talking about everyone who is concerned about human rights, cares about what's happened to Israelis as well. I imagine there are people who don't, just as there are many people who don't care about what happens to Palestinians. This is the nature, unfortunately, of conflict, and especially of this conflict, and especially of this conflict over the last year and a half. But it simply is not the case that the Red Cross and the United Nations are indifferent to the suffering of Israeli hostages. It's just not true. I don't blame Eli Sharabi for this. How is he supposed to know? I certainly don't think that in the few weeks that he's been out of captivity that he's gone and researched all of this stuff, and also I think the fact that he didn't mention it before until his testimony at the UN is telling. I believe that this was something that he was given to say by the Israeli government, either by them saying, this happened, you should really mention it, or them just coming to him and said, put this in your speech. Whatever it was, I have no doubt that the Israeli government, with Danny Danon sitting next to Eli during his testimony, directed this part of it. And he also talked about how Hamas had stolen aid that was meant for Palestinians. Now, this is an issue that has come up before. It's been looked into. It hasn't been corroborated. And I don't know exactly, we can't know exactly, of course, what Eli saw. I have no doubt he saw his captors with boxes of UNRWA aid. The aid is given out. It's given out to everyone. UNRWA has no way to filter out Hamas members being part of the crowds that are being given the aid to whom they're distributed. Hamas's members, their families, are certainly entitled to that aid. I think the idea that somehow you can give aid to everybody except the particular people in Hamas is absurd. And naturally, Hamas is not deciding to starve themselves. They have no better access to food in general outside of the aid than anyone else in Gaza. It is now. That being said, there have been accusations of Hamas stealing aid. They have not been substantiated. We have not heard a big outcry from the people of Gaza. And let's remember, there are many of us, myself included, but literally tens of thousands of us who are listening, who know people in Gaza, who are listening to community leaders, to people who are on social media and talking about what's going on in Gaza. The idea that all of those people would not say anything about Hamas stealing aid is absurd. There have been a few, but it's been from dubious sources in many cases, and there just hasn't been a loud outcry. There would have been. People would have heard this if that was going on. That being said, again, it is possible that we're missing something. It is possible that something's being picked up on. I guarantee you that Israel certainly would not know about it if we don't. And I also feel certain that what Eli Sharabi saw in the tunnels is certainly not conclusive proof that is a serious widespread problem, and we don't even know what he really saw. If he saw, there were 20 people holding him hostages, and a bunch of them came in with these boxes, um, then that's what he saw. It doesn't necessarily translate to Hamas stealing UNRWA aid. We would need to find out much more than the sort of offhand half a sentence that he two or a couple of sentences that he gave in his testimony at the UN. We need to find out much more. And I think that also explains, by the way, why a lot of this has not gotten more play in the media. You would think it would have been made a bigger deal. It wasn't. And this is probably why. But I do think it is indicative of something, which is that the Israeli government is working with Eli, or working on Eli might be a more appropriate way to put it, in terms of what his testimony is. There were things that were absent from his testimony, and I think these are very interesting because there was a controversy recently over Eli Sharabi because what he said in earlier interviews, including on Ufta, was that irresponsible comments from government leaders led to harm to the hostages. When their captors felt threatened or heard Ben Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich making these big statements about how they're going to wipe out everybody in Palestine, um, there was retribution taken out on the hostages. That is unacceptable. Let us be clear about this. That is not okay. Whatever Ben Gvir or Smotrich or Netanyahu or anyone else says, it's not okay to take it out on captives. Okay. However, that being said, if you know that's going to happen, you should probably be a little bit more judicious about what you're saying, you would think, if you care about the hostages. Another hostage, Elia Cohen, said the same thing. And in response, Ben Gvir essentially gave them the middle finger. He said, I'm not sorry for what I said. I'll say it again. I'll continue to say it. And the fact that they threatened to harm the hostages in response, it doesn't matter to me, he says. When the daughter-in-law of a man who had been killed in Gaza brought up similar points to Bezalel Smotrich, he said, you've been heard, now get out. Thank you. That's what he said. I think these are important points. And I think the fact that we didn't hear Eli talk about this in his UN testimony is significant. I think the fact that one of the things he said in his Uda interview was that these are small little tunnels, they're dark, and we were always very afraid of what would happen when we were being moved through the tunnels, that somebody would put a bullet in our head. He added that because of this, there is this idea that you can make these Hollywood style dramatic raids into these tunnels and come out with rescued hostages is nonsense. It is impossible. That's what he said. He didn't say it to the UN though. Interestingly, again, I think the absence of these things and the presence, the sudden addition of the other matters that I mentioned, all indicate that there's a lot of coaching and a lot of pushing being done on Eli Sharabi. And that is, I think, barbaric, quite frankly, because we need to look at this and we need to understand that the hostages that remain in Gaza, dead or alive, could all have been freed. And let's also remember many of the ones who have been killed, whether by Israeli attacks or by Hamas or just due to the conditions, they could have all been home. They could have been home a year ago, more than a year ago. They certainly could have been home last summer once the ceasefire plan was presented. They certainly could have been home by now when Israel accepted, at least in word, the ceasefire plan in January. They move on to the second phase. The second phase was supposed to see the release of all the hostages. Israel refused unilaterally, even though Hamas stuck to their side of the bargain. Israel never intended to go through with this. They always intended to leave hostages in Gaza. Where's the outrage among Jewish leaders here? Why are they not yelling and screaming about this? Why are we hearing this nonsense as if it's acceptable that Hamas broke the ceasefire because they wouldn't agree to rework a deal that both sides had signed and that Hamas had adhered to? This notion that what Israel is doing now, this notion, and it's being pushed by Steve Witkoff, it's being pushed by Donald Trump, that what we're seeing happening right now, the resumption of the full-scale genocide in Gaza, that this is somehow the fault of Hamas because they wouldn't rework a deal that they signed and that they had adhered to that would have seen the release of all the hostages in exchange for Palestinian hostages and the end of uh, the Israeli genocide, which meant that Israel would pull out of Gaza. That was what phase two was supposed to be. But Israel wouldn't even talk about it. Wouldn't even talk about it. And when push came to shove and phase one's end date approached, Israel and the United States started coming up with, well, we can do this and we can extend phase one. Extending phase one meant releasing more hostages in exchange for Palestinian hostages, absolutely, but did not, but meant that they would not address at all the removal of Israeli troops from Gaza. So more hostages out, Israel's still standing at the ready to resume the genocide. Why should Hamas agree to that? Why? It's ridiculous. No party would agree to that. There was a deal on the table that Israel abandoned it. And in so doing, they abandoned the Israelis that are in Gaza. And they did it because what they wanted to do was resume the genocide against the people of Gaza. That was what this was about. That is still what this is about. And to reinforce their ability to do it and to get away with it, they are using Eli Sharabi. And it was sad for me. It was enraging to me to see him being used like that. You look at Eli Sharabi, and there are pictures of what Eli looked like before October 7th. Um, and what he looked like, not only when he was released was bad enough, but even now, weeks after his release, he's half the man he was. It's a terrible thing. I mean, he's clearly a haunted man. He's been through a lot, and to use him in this way, I think, is contemptible. Absolutely contemptible, and it's something that is being supported not only by the Trump administration, but by a great many supporters of Israel, including in the Jewish community right now. And it needs to stop. Using this man in this manner is disgusting. It is morally reprehensible. And the way he's being manipulated and used by his own government should be unacceptable to all of us. It should be unacceptable to those of us in the pro-Palestine movement. It should be unacceptable to those who are pro-Israel. It should be unacceptable to everyone. But if, I suppose, you're willing to argue, as some people are, and I will have an article up about this, might even be up by the time you're seeing this on my Substack page. If you are such a person who believes that the killing of, say, for example, 6 Hamas government officials, people who were not involved in the military side of Hamas, not involved in the armed wing, but they were part of the governing structure that existed in Gaza before October 7th, that killing 6 of those people is worth killing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of civilians, including over 200 children. I guess manipulating a former Israeli hostage like Eli is nothing compared to that. I mean, if you're that morally bankrupt, I guess what more can I expect? But I do think that it's worth all of our time to stand up against all of it. If we're standing up against the genocide, we should also stand up against the way Israel and the United States are using Eli Sharabi and the experiences of Israeli hostages, dead and alive, to justify genocide. And the fact that Israel is willing to throw away the lives of those hostages to continue that genocide is something we should not be quiet about while we are raising a voice against the genocide as a whole, because it says a lot about what Israel's doing and how Israel's going about it and how Israel really values human life. We know that they place no value on Palestinian life, and certainly they place more value on Jewish lives on Israeli lives. I would not say that's not true, but although that has its own objectionable, obviously, and immoral overtones to it. But that it shows you that they're willing to throw away Israeli lives in order to commit this genocide tells you, I think, all you need to know. So please like and subscribe. Please share this. Please tell your friends. Please consider it. Feel free to comment in a civil manner, please. Uh, with any points you think need to be raised about this. Um, and please do support this work if you can. In these times, it is particularly important to get real analysis that isn't beholden to anyone but the truth as the analyst sees it, which is what you're getting here. Um, in a time when almost everything is being manipulated and filled with half truths. So thank you for listening, and let's move forward.